Created with free version for non-commercial use.
In this lesson, we will learn how to create a page layout using CSS. Or in other words, we will learn how to position elements to sit side by side one another to give the appearance of columns. Up until now, in this course, we've seen elements sit below and above one another, taking up the entire available width of the browser window. Well, in this lesson, we will learn how to take control and give specific widths to elements and have them sit side by side. It's going to be a lot of fun, so let's get started. Here we are in our text editor, and this is an example page that we're viewing. We can see that it has nothing more than a header and a footer. So if we view this in the web browser, we can see that there is no main meat and potato body content in between the header and footer. So let's add that now together. So our goal for this lesson is to create two sections that sit side by side, giving the appearance of columns. So first we'll create a div and give it a class of main area. Then we'll create another element using the aside element and give it a class of sidebar. Now let's add a bit of space filler text to both of these elements. Paragraph. This is the main area or column, and then include a bit of space filler text. And then we'll also do that in the sidebar element. This is the sidebar. Okay, so if we save and refresh, we can see that our web page now has a bit of content. We are now ready to begin writing bits of CSS code to style the page. The first thing that I want to customize about the page is the overall width. So currently, all of the content is filling the entire browser window width. This is a problem because the human eye only prefers to read so many words per line. So in order to avoid eye fatigue for our site visitors, we need to add some sort of maximum width to our overall content. Now there are many ways of achieving this, but I'll show you my favorite way of doing it. I'm going to create a div with a class of container. And I'm going to move all of our content inside it. So I'm copying, cutting, and then I'm going to paste. So now everything lives inside this one parent ancestor container element. Now in our CSS, let's target that element, dot container, and I'm going to say maximum width, max width, 940 pixels. So if I save and refresh, we can see that there's a cutoff now. Instead of filling the full window, it cuts off right where my mouse cursor is. However, wouldn't it be nice if this width was horizontally centered in the browser window? It's very easy to achieve that. We can say margin left, auto, margin right, auto. We know that the margin property controls the space around elements, and if we assign it a value of auto to both directions horizontally, it will be centered. Moving on, the next thing that I want to achieve is I want to wrap our two sections that we want to be columns in some sort of parent element. So that content begins here and it ends here. So I'm going to create a new div named content area. And then I want to move our two content sections, main area and sidebar. I want to cut and paste those to live within the newly created content area div. Next, I want to style content area to have borders above and below it. So in our CSS, we'll target content area, border top, 3 pixels solid black, border bottom, 3 pixels solid black. So if we refresh, you can see that the borders have been applied. All that remains now is to position these two sections, this and this, to sit side by side one another instead of stacking on top of each other. We will begin by targeting or selecting this section with our CSS. So that section's name is main area. It has a class of main area, and we're going to give it a width. So we'll say only take up 66% of the available width. So we can see that our width property is being observed, but the two sections are still not sitting side by side. So we will now use a property named float, and we will tell the main area to float to the left. we can see a few interesting things taking place. We can see that the main content, or the main column, is now floated to the left, and we can see the beginnings of a two-column layout. However, it's not perfect because the sidebar, as we can see, is trying to wrap itself around the floated content. So let's add a little bit additional text to the sidebar so you can really see the effect that I'm trying to describe. See how the sidebar is trying to wrap around the main column? We don't want that. We want two distinct columns. Now this layout that we currently see is hinting at the true nature of the float property. So we used float left. Now when you hear the word float, I want you to think of the print world. So a newspaper or a magazine. Typically you'll see images floated to the left or the right, and the main text of the article wraps itself around the image. Well, that's exactly what's going on in our layout currently. If you imagine this was an image instead of the main column, you can see that it's floated to the side and the other content around it is aware of it and is trying to wrap around it. So in order to create two fully distinct columns where there's no sort of wrapping around, we simply need to float the sidebar element as well. So we'll target it with our CSS. It has a class of sidebar. We'll give it a width of 34%, and we'll also float it to the left. So if we refresh, we can see that we now have two distinct columns. Now you may be wondering why we chose these width values. We will circle back around to that in just a couple of minutes, but for now we have bigger fish to fry. You will recall that we had added a wrapper div for our two columns. So main area and sidebar both live within this parent div of content area. Now up until just a moment ago, this content area parent div had a top and bottom border. But you'll notice that as soon as we set things up so that both sections were floated, it's as if the parent element is not aware that it has any child content whatsoever. This is because parent elements are only aware of child content that is not floated. So for example, if we create a paragraph directly within content area, hello world, and refresh, we will see that the content area div respects and is aware of this content. We can see it's trying to draw a border above and below it. Now all we want is for the content area parent div to be aware of its two floated children as well. This bottom border should be sitting down here where my mouse is. Now we do not want a hello world paragraph, so we'll remove that and we're back to the drawing board. So how can we get this wrapper or parent div to be aware of the floated children? We can clear our floats. So after the code for our two columns, main area and sidebar, but still within the content area parent div, we'll create a new element, div, and we'll give it a class of fix. So now we have something that we can target in our CSS that sits below the floated elements. Now in our CSS, we'll create a class that targets that. Clear. We use the clear property. Now we can say left or right, depending on the type of floats we used, but a good catch-all is to simply use the phrase both. So now if we refresh, we can see that we're in luck. So essentially, this new div that we added with a class of fix that sits below the floated elements is waving its arms in the air and it's saying, hey, parent element, content area, look at me, I exist, I am clearing the floats. And because this element sits below the floated elements, the parent element is then aware of all of the child content. However, it's not considered a best practice to have HTML code that is completely meaningless. So this is an empty div. It has no content within it. So that means it truly has no purpose other than to make our layout work. So while this technically gets the job done, it's far from ideal. So let's delete this, and instead I'll show you a strategy that most web developers use. The parent element, content area, we will add a second utility class to it. So we'll add a class of group. Yes, you can assign multiple classes to a single element by simply including a space. So we're going to create a utility class named group. When I say utility, I simply mean that we can reuse this anywhere on our page where we have a parent or container element with floated children, and we need that parent element to be self-sufficient. We need it to be able to automatically clear its own floated children. So this method is referred to as the ClearFix method, and it's the weapon of choice for most web developers. Now the ClearFix method is not something that you need to memorize, it's something that you copy and paste. So I'm literally just going to paste in some code. So essentially all of these selectors are targeting the group class, and they're adding an empty bit of content before and after it, and then they're clearing it. And then we have this rule for older legacy versions of Internet Explorer so that our floats are cleared in every browser and every device under the sun. This code is completely bulletproof. I use it in all of my websites, and you can find it in the course materials so you can paste it into your websites. Now that we have this in place, you can use the group class anywhere in your HTML. So if we save and refresh, we can see that even though we no longer have any sort of element beneath the columns, because we added this group class, the parent element will automatically clear its floated children. Now this lesson is almost complete, but before we end it, I want to address some of the most commonly asked questions about layouts and floats. So the first question is, how or why did I choose these width values for the two columns, 66 and 34%? The reason I chose these width values is because I wanted a layout where the main column used 2/3 of the available width and the sidebar used 1/3 of the available width. From a CSS perspective, I really just wanted these two values to add up to 100% because I wanted to make use of all of the available width. But you don't have to follow this rule of thirds. Instead, what if you wanted the two columns to be equal in width? You could simply each give them 50% of the width. Typically, we want our columns to add up to 100%, but they don't have to. So I could set this to 40. 40 plus 50 only equals 90. And if I refresh, you can see we're only using about 90% of the available width. So there are no rules to creating layouts. You can have your columns take up as much space as you prefer. Another common question is, why are we using percentage values for width instead of pixel values? The answer is that it's a matter of preference. There's no right or wrong choice. So if we wanted to use pixel values instead of percentage values, we would need to first ask ourselves, how large is the container? So how much available space do we have at our disposal? So you'll remember that the overall container for the entire page was given a maximum width of 940 pixels. So we most likely want our column widths to add up to 940. So we could give the main column a width of 640 pixels, and we could give the sidebar a width of 300 pixels. And visually, this is identical to the layout we saw when we used 66% and 34%. Now, if you do prefer to use pixel values for the width of your columns, make sure that the container element that they're sitting in does not use max width for its own width, but instead have it use simply width. Now at this point in the course, please do not begin worrying about creating a one-size-fits-all beautiful responsive website. That is completely outside the scope of this lesson and what we're trying to focus on at the moment. In future lessons, we will learn about responsive web designs and how to create different layouts at different screen sizes. But for now, let's get used to creating floats and columns and dealing with width values, and rest assured that learning how to create more flexible layouts will come later on in the course. Let's move on to the final frequently asked question before we close out this lesson. And that question is, why would we bother creating a reusable class that lets parents auto-clear their children instead of just structuring our page in a way where we could rely on the footer to use the clear property to clear the floats? That's an excellent question. In a perfect world, we could set up web pages where there's always a conveniently located element beneath the floats that clears the floats. But in the real world, that is simply not the case. When you begin creating web layouts, you will quickly realize that you need your content to be self-contained modules. You need to move bits of content around throughout the page, and you need them to clear themselves. You can't always rely on the element beneath it to take care of clearing it. Now, the more you begin experimenting creating layouts, the more you will find that having a reusable utility class to clear the child floats is a true lifesaver. Now we've covered a lot in this lesson. Here's a very quick review. To have sections of a web page sit side by side one another, or in other words to create columns, we add the float property to an element and we also assign it a width value. If you're using floats to create column layouts, you need to be sure to clear your floats, and we learned several different ways of doing that. And finally, we learned about different ways of managing our width values. Now this was a fairly technical lesson, so if something didn't make sense, and if it feels like a lot of information to absorb at once, that's absolutely okay. Again, these are topics that we will relearn and continue to revisit throughout the course. I'll see you in the next lesson.
Created with free version for non-commercial use.